Hello everyone, and welcome to ASMR Storytime. I wanted to take a moment and thank you for watching this video and remind you guys to please leave a comment, subscribe, and like. Let me know what you'd like to see, what you don't like about these videos. I'm open to suggestions. Let's get started. Today, we're going to read part 2, chapter 4 of The Red Tent. I am not certain whether my earliest memories are truly mine, because when I bring them to mind, I feel my mother's breath on every word. But I do remember the taste of the water from our well, bright and cold against my milk teeth. I am sure that I was caught up by strong arms every time I stumbled, for I do not recall a time in my early life when I was alone or afraid. Like every beloved child, I knew I was the most important person in my mother's world, and most important not only to my mother, Leah, but to my mother aunties as well. Although they adored their sons, I was the one they dressed up and dandled when the boys were wrestling in the dirt. I was the one who continued going to the red tent with them long after I was weaned. As a baby, Joseph was my constant companion, first my milk brother and later my truest friend. At 8 months, he stood up and walked over to me in my favorite spot at the front of my mother's tent. Though many months older, I was still unsteady on my feet, probably because my aunties liked to carry me. Joseph held out both hands to me and I stood up. My mother said that in return for showing me how to walk, I taught him to speak. Joseph liked to tell people that his first words was Dina, though Rachel assured me it was the word for Mama, Ima. No one thought Rachel would bear another child after the awful time she had had with Joseph, so he and I received the treatment given to the final fruit of a chief wife. According to the custom of the old days, the youngest child inherited a mother's blessing, and one way or another, fathers usually followed suit. But Joseph and I were petted and spoiled also because we were the babies, our mother's last born and our father's joy. We were also our older brother's victims. H was two separate tribes among the children of Jacob. Reuben, Simon, Levi, and Judah were nearly men by the time I knew their names. They were often gone, tending to the herds with our father, and as a group, they had little use for us small ones. Reuben was by nature kind to children, but we avoided Simon and Levi, who laughed at us and teased. Tally and Isa, the twins. How do you know which of you is which? Levi taunted. Simon was even worse. If one of you dies, our mother won't mourn, since she'll have one exactly the same. That always made Tally cry. I thought I saw longing in the way Judah watched our games. He was far too old to play with us, but was the youngest of the older brothers. He was the least among them and suffered for it. Judah often carried me on his back and called me Ahati, little sister. I thought of him as my companion among the big boys. At first, Zebulun was the leader of the younger ones, and he might have been a bully had we not adored him and obeyed him willingly. Dan was his lieutenant, loyal and sweet as you'd expect of Bilhah's child. Gad and Asher were wild, headstrong, and difficult playmates, but they were such wonderful mimics, mocking Laban's lumbering walk and the drink-slurred speech with such wicked accuracy. We forgave them anything in exchange for their performance. Naphtali, who was never called anything but Tali, and Issachar, or Isa, tried to lord it over me and Joseph because they were nearly 2 years older. They would call us babies, but a minute later they would join us on the ground, tossing a pebble into the air to see how many other stones we could pick up with the same hand. It was our favorite game until I could pick up 10 stones to their 5. Then my brothers declared it a game fit only for girls and never played again. By our 6th year, Joseph and I had taken charge of the younger band because we were the best at making up stories. Our brothers carried us from the well to my mother's tent and bowed low before me, their queen. They would pretend to die when Joseph, their king, pointed a finger at them. He sent them out to do battle with demons and to bring us great riches. They crowned our heads with garland of weeds and kissed our hands. I remember the day the game ended. Tally and Esau were doing my bidding, piling up little stones on an altar in my honor. Dan and Zebulun were fanning us with leaves. Gad and Asher were dancing before us. Then our older brothers happened by. Reuben and Judah smiled and walked on, but Simon and Levi stopped and laughed. Look at how the babes lead the bigger boys by the nose. Wait until we tell our father that Zebulun and Dan are donkeys for the bare behinds. He'll make them wait another 2 years before letting them come up to the high pasture with us. They did not stop mocking until Joseph and I were alone, abandoned by our playmates, who suddenly saw themselves with their brothers' cold eyes. After that, Zebulun and Dan refused to do any more spinning for our mothers, and after much begging, they were permitted to follow their older brothers into the hills. The 2 sets of twins, when they weren't pulling weeds from the garden or helping at the loom, played by themselves, and the four of them became a tribe of their own, dedicated to hunting games and wrestling matches. Joseph and I turned more and more to each other, but it wasn't as much fun with just the two of us. Neither of us bent a knee to the other for the sake of a story, and Joseph had to contend with the taunts of our brothers who abused him for playing with me at all. There were very few girls in our camp. The women joked that Jacob had poisoned the well against them. I tried to make friends with the few daughters of the bondswomen, but I was either too old or too young for their games, and so by the time I could carry a water jar from the well, I started to think of myself as a member of my mother's circle. Not that children were often left to their games. As soon as we were old enough to carry a few sticks of wood, we were put to work, pulling weeds and insects from the garden, carrying water, carding wool, and spinning. I do not remember a time before my hand held a spindle. I remember being scolded for my clumsiness, for getting burrs in my wool, and for the unevenness of my string. Leah was the best mother, but she was not the best teacher. Skills came to her so easily that she could not understand how even a small child could fail to grasp something so simple as the turning of string. She lost patience with me often. How is it that a daughter of Leah could have such unlucky fingers? She said one day, looking at the tangle I had made of my work. I hated her for those words. For the first time in my life, I hated my mother. My face grew hot as tears came to my eyes, and I threw the whole day's spinning into the dirt. It was a terrible act of waste and disrespect, and I think neither of us could believe that I had done it. In an instant, the sharp slap of her palm against my cheek cracked the air. I was far more shocked than hurt. Although my mother cuffed my brothers from time to time, it was the first time she had ever struck me. I stood there for a long moment, watching her face twist in pain over what she had done. Without a word, I turned and ran to find Beelah's lap, where I wept and moaned about the terrible wrong that had been done to me. I told my aunt everything that lay heavy upon my heart. I wept over my useless fingers, which would never get the wool to twist evenly or the spindle to drop and turn smoothly. I was afraid that I had shamed my mother by being so awkward, and I was ashamed of the hatred I suddenly felt toward the one I loved so completely. Beelah stroked my hair until I stopped crying and fed me a piece of bread dipped in sweet wine. "Now I will show you the secret of the spindle," she said, putting a finger on my lips. "This is something your grandmother taught me, and now it's my turn to show you." Beelah put me on her lap, for which I was nearly too large. Her arms were barely long enough to reach around me, but there I sat, a baby once again, embraced in the safety while Beelah whispered the story of you two in my ear. Once before women knew how to turn wool into string and string into cloth, people roamed the earth naked. They burned by day and shivered by night, and their babies perished. But you two heard the weeping mothers and took pity on them. You two was the daughter of Nana, a god of the moon and of Ninhursag, the mother of the plains. You two asked her father if she might teach the women how to spin and weave so their babies would live. Nana scoffed and said that women were too stupid to remember the order of cutting, washing, and combing of wool, the building of looms, the setting of woof and warp, and their fingers were too thick to master the art of spinning. But because Nana loved his daughter, he let her go. You two went first to the east, to the land of the Green River, But the women there never put aside their drums and flutes to listen to the goddess. Utu went to the south, but she arrived in the middle of a terrible drought, when the sun had robbed the women of their memories. We need nothing but rain, they said, forgetting the months when their children had died of cold. Give us rain or go away. Utu traveled north, where the fur-clad women were so fierce they tore off a breast to ready themselves for the endless hunt. Those women were too hot-headed for the slow arts of string and loom. Utu went to the east, where the sun rises, but found the men had stolen the women's tongues, and they could not answer for themselves. Since Utu did not know how to speak to men, she came to Ur, which is the womb of the world, where she met the woman called Inhinduana, who wished to learn. Utu took Inhinduana to her lap and wrapped her great arms around Inhinduana's small arms and laid her golden hands around Inhinduana's clay hands and guided her left hand and guided her right hand. Utu dropped a spindle made of lapis lazuli, which turned like a great blue ball floating in the golden sky, and spun string made of sunlight. Inhinduana fell asleep in Utu's lap. As Inhinduana slept, she spun without seeing or knowing, without effort or fatigue. She spun until there was enough string to fill the entire storehouse of the great god Nana. He was so pleased that he permitted Utu to teach Inhinduana's daughters how to make pottery and bronze, music and wine. After that, the people could stop eating grass and drinking water and ate bread and drank beer instead. And their babies swaddled in wool blankets no longer died of the cold, but grew up to offer up sacrifice to the gods. While Bila told me the story of Utu, she put her nimble hands around my clumsy ones. I smelled the soft, loamy musk that clung to my youngest auntie and listened to her sweet, liquid voice and forgot all about the ache in my heart. And when her story was over, she had showed me that the string on my spindle was as evenly made and strong as Leah's own handiwork. I kissed Bila 100 kisses and ran to show my mother what I had done. She embraced me as though I had returned from the dead. There was no more slapping after that. I even came to enjoy the task of twisting clouds of unruly wool into fine, strong threads that became my family's clothing and blankets and trade goods. I learned to love the way that my mind wandered where it would, while my hands followed their own course. Even when I was old and my spinning was of linen rather than wool, I recalled my auntie's perfume and the way she pronounced the name of the goddess Utu. I told Joseph the story of Utu the weaver. I told him the tale of the great goddess Inanna's journey to the land of the dead, and of her marriage to the shepherd king, Dumuzi, whose love ensured an abundance of dates and wine and rain. These were stories I heard in the red tent, told and retold by my mothers and the occasional trader's wife who called the gods and goddesses by unfamiliar names, and sometimes supplied different endings to the ancient tales. Joseph, in turn, told me the story of Isaac's binding and the miracle of his release, and of our great-grandfather Abram's meeting with messengers from the gods. He told me that our father Jacob spoke to the El of his fathers morning and evening, even when he made no sacrifice. Our father said that the formless, faceless God, with no other names than God, came to him by night in his dreams and by day in the solitude only, and that Jacob was sure that the future of his sons would be blessed by this one. Joseph described to me the wondrous grove of terebinth trees in Mamre, where our great-grandmother spoke of her gods every evening, and where someday our father would take us to pour a libation in the name of Sharai. Those were the stories Joseph heard from Jacob sitting among our brothers while the sheep and the goats grazed. I thought the women's stories were prettier, but Joseph preferred our father's tales. Our talk was not usually so lofty. We shared the secret of our sex and begetting and laughed aghast to think of our parents behaving like the dogs in the dust. We gossiped endlessly about our brothers keeping close watch on the rivalry between Simon and Levi, which could flare into blows over something as trivial as the placement of a staff against a tree. There was an ongoing contest, too, between Judah and Zebulun, the two oxen among the brothers, but theirs was a good-natured battle to see which was the stronger, and each would applaud his brother's ability to lift great rocks and carry full-grown ewes across a meadow. Joseph and I watched as Zilpah's sons became our mother's champions, for Gad and Asher were embarrassed by their own mother's eccentricities. Her ability to make decent bread sent them to Leah's tent. They did not understand or value Zilpah's skill at the loom, and of course they had no way of knowing her talent for storytelling. So they carried their little trophies, flowers, brightly colored stones, the remains of a bird's nest to my mother's lap. She would tousle their hair and feed them, and they would strut like little heroes. On the other hand, Tally and Esau, the twins of Leah's own womb, were not so fond of her. They hated looking so much alike, and they blamed their mother for it. They did everything they could to distinguish themselves from each other and were almost never seen together. Esau attached himself to Rachel, who seemed charmed by his attentions and let him carry and fetch for her. Tally became fast friends with Bilhah's Dan, and the two of them liked to sleep side by side in Bilhah's tent, hanging on the words of their big brother Reuben, who was also drawn to the peace and stillness that enveloped his aunt. Leah tried to bribe Esau and Tally back to her with sweets and extra bread, but she was far too busy with the work of her family to pine for attentions from two of her many sons. And she did not suffer for lack of love. When I caught her watching one of her boys walking toward another mother's tent at nightfall, I would pull at her hand. Then she would lift me up so that our eyes could meet and kiss me on one cheek, and then on the other, and then on the tip of my nose. This always made me laugh, which would in turn always bring a warm smile to my mother's face. One of my great secrets was knowing I had the power to make her smile. My world was filled with mothers and brothers, work and games, new moons and good food. The hills in the distance held my life in a bowl filled with everything I could possibly want. I was a child when my father led us away from the land of the two rivers south to the country of my birth. Young as I was, I knew why we were going. I could feel the hot wall of anger between my father and my grandfather. I could almost see the heat between them on the rare occasions that they sat together. Laban resented my father for his accomplishments with the herds and for his sons, who were so plentiful and so much more skillful than his own two boys. Laban hated the fact that he owed his success to the husband of his daughters. His mouth turned sour whenever Jacob's name was mentioned. As for my father, although he was one who caused the flocks to multiply, the camp to fill with bondsmen, and the traders to make their way to our tents, he was never more than Laban's servant. His wages were meager, But he was thrifty and clever with his little store of goods, and he had been careful with the breeding of his own small flock of brindled goats and gray sheep. Jacob hated Laban's sloth and the way he and his son squandered his own good work. When the older boy, Kemuel, left his post guarding the rutting goats one spring, the best of them died from the battle between the strongest males. When Beor drank too much wine and slept, a hawk made off with a newborn kid Jacob had marked for sacrifice. The worst was when Laban lost Jacob's best 2 dogs, his smartest and his best loved. The man had gone for a 3-day trading journey to Carchemish, and without asking had taken the dogs to tend a herd so small a boy could have managed on his own. While Laban was in town, he had sold them both for a pittance, which he then lost in a game of chance. The loss of his dogs put my father in rage. The night Laban returned to camp, I heard their shouts and curses even as I fell asleep. Afterward, my father's scowl was impenetrable. His fists did not unclench until he had sought our Leah and poured out the details of the latest grievance. My mother and aunts had nothing but sympathy for Jacob. Their loyalty to Laban had never been strong, and as the years passed, they piled up reasons to despise him. Laziness, deceitfulness, the arrogance of his thick-headed sons, and his treatment of Rudy, which only worsened as the years passed. A few days after the fight about the dogs, Rudy came to my mother and threw herself on the ground. "I am lost," she cried, a sad puddle of a woman in the dust. Her hair was loose and covered with ashes, as though she had been buried in her own mother. Laban had lost more than his coins in the Carchemish game. He had gambled away Rudy as well, and now a traitor had arrived to claim her as his slave. Laban sat in his tent and refused to come out and acknowledge what he had done to the mother of his sons. But the traitor had his walking staff as a bond and his overseer as a witness. Rudy put her forehead to the ground and begged Leah for help. Leah listened and then turned to spit on her father's name. "The backside of the donkey has more merit than Laban," she said. "My father is a snake. He is a putrefied offal of a snake." She put down the jug of milk she was working into curd, and with heavy steps marched to the near pasture where my father was still brooding about his dogs. My mother was so deep in her thoughts she did not seem to notice that I followed her. Leah's cheeks turned red as she approached her husband, and then she did something extraordinary. Leah got down on her knees and, taking Jacob's hand, kissed his fingers. Watching my mother submit like this was like seeing a sheep hunting a jackal or a man nursing a baby. My mother, who never wanted for words, nearly stuttered as she spoke. "Husband, father of my children, beloved friend," she said, "I come to plead a case without merit, for pure pity's sake. Husband," she said. "Jacob," she whispered, "you know I place my life in your keeping only, and that my father's name is an abomination to me. Even so, I come to ask that you redeem my father's woman from the slavery to which he has sold her. A man from Carchemish has come to claim Rudy from Laban, staked in his game of chance, and as though she were an animal from the flock or a stranger among us, and not the mother of his sons. I ask you to treat her better than her own husband, and I ask you to act as the father." Jacob frowned at his wife's request, although in his heart he must have been pleased that she addressed him not only as her husband, but as a leader of her family as well. He stood above Leah, whose head was bowed, and looked down on her tenderly. "Wife," he said, and and took her hands to raise her up. Their eyes met and she smiled. I was shocked. I had come to watch Rudy's story unfold, but I discovered something else altogether. I saw the heat between my mother and her husband. I saw that Jacob could cause the glow of assent and happiness that I thought only I could summon from Leah. My eyes opened for the first time upon the fact that my father was a man. I saw that he was not only tall, but also broad-shouldered and narrow in the waist. Although by then he must have passed his 40th summer, his back was straight and still, and he still had most of his teeth and a clear eye. My father was handsome, I realized. My father was worthy of my mother. Yet I found no consolation in this discovery. As they moved back to the tents, Leah and Jacob walked side by side, their heads nearly touching as she whispered the ransom that Jacob could collect from among the wives to redeem Rudy. Honey and herbs, a stack of copper bangles, a bolt of linen, and 3 of wool. He listened silently, nodding from time to time. There was no room for me between them, no need for me. My mother's eyes were full of Jacob. I did not matter to her the way she mattered to me. I wanted to cry, but I realized that I was too old for that. I would be a woman soon, and I would have to learn how to live with a divided heart. Miserable, I followed as my parents entered the circle of tents. Leah fell silent and resumed her place behind her husband. She fetched the jug of her strongest beer to help Jacob soften the trader's resolve. But the man had seen that though she was worn out and homely, Laban's woman was neither hair-lipped nor lame, as her price had led him to believe, and he was shrewd enough to notice that his presence had caused a stir. He smelled his advantage, which meant it took all of the women's treasures and one of Jacob's pups before the trader forgave the debt and left without Rudy. Soon all the women of the camp knew what had happened, and for weeks afterwards Jacob ate like a prince. Laban never spoke of how Jacob went ransom his wife. He only became fouler in his use of Rudy, whose eyes seemed permanently blackened after that. Her sons, following their father's patterns, showed their mother no respect. They carried no water for her cooking pot and brought her no game from their hunts. She crept around her men in silent service. Among the women, Rudy spoke only of her mother's kindness. She became Leah's shadow, kissing her hands and her hem, sitting as close to her Savior as she could. The ragged woman's presence did not please Leah, who occasionally lost patience with her. "Go to your tent," she said when Rudy got underfoot, but Leah always regretted rebuking Rudy, who cringed at a single cross-word from my mother. After she sent her away, Leah sought her out and sat down beside her, the poor wasted soul, and let herself be kissed and thanked again and again. I hope you're enjoying the story. Again, I'd like to thank you for joining us here at ASMR Storytime. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and happy sleeping.